Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. We are squeezing in an extra episode on Friday because I want to continue on with our series that we started last week of working through mere Christianity. I got a lot of really good feedback on this, a lot of great emails of people who were inspired to go pick up this book and read ahead, and also people who wrote in who've read the book and said that the commentary was helpful to them. So I'm delighted to hear that. I'm not going to spend too much on the preamble here, except to say if you're just hopping in now, it would really behoove you to go back and listen to those first two episodes. We read through the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity, where Lewis is developing a very famous presentation of the moral argument, which we also explored and offered some additional commentary on. And what he's trying to do is work through the realm of moral and natural philosophy to narrow down the list of possibly true religions. So that's what's cool about Mere Christianity is he doesn't start just from a position of pure faith of, okay, I just believe this is true, and then let's explore what it's about. But he's working his way philosophically to a consistent and coherent religious worldview. And the argument he decides to start with is the moral argument. And so he's making arguments both for moral realism, that objective moral values and duties are in fact a part of reality, and we need to be able to account for these. We need something that can explain this part of reality. And that's kind of where we got. And we're now about to head into book 2, which is entitled What Christians Believe. But he's gonna draw out the final touches of this moral argument. So I'm not going to recap too much. Again, just go back and listen to those first 2 episodes, but I will offer additional commentary as we work through this. So without any further ado, please don't mind the page changes. I'm going to start reading this to you. So we're in book 2, chapter 1 of Mere Christianity, and this chapter is called The Rival. Without any further ado, please don't mind the page changes. I'm going to start reading this to you. So we're in book 2, chapter 1 of Mere Christianity, and this chapter is called The Rival Conceptions of God. So now that he's sort of established that we need some type of transcendent anchor point to make sense of objective moral values and duties, let's start working through some of the rival conceptions of God and see if any of these can line up or best explain what we know about the world through our direct moral experience, philosophical reflection, etc. So that's where I think Lewis is going to take us. I know, I've read this book a million times. So, all right. Let me do my snorts and my coughs so I can try and read this straight for you. This is, of course, book 2, chapter 1, The Rival Conceptions of God. Here we go. I have been asked to tell you what Christians believe, and I am going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that all other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. If you are a Christian, you are free to think that all those religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered to them most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But, of course, being a Christian does not mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there is only one right answer to a sum, and all other answers are wrong, but some of the wrong answers are much nearer to being right than others. The first big division of humanity is into the majority who believe in right than others. The first big division of humanity is into the majority who believe in some kind of god or gods, and the minority who do not. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority, lines up with the ancient Greeks and Romans, modern savages, Stoics, Platonists, Hindus, Islam, etc., against the modern Western European materialist. Now I go on to the next big division, People who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God they believe in. There are two very different ideas on the subject. One of them is the idea that he is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people, that is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man, but you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills cancer. It all depends on your point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or right or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that God is beyond good and evil, is called Pantheism. It was held by the great Russian philosopher Hegel, and, as far as I can understand them, by the Hindus. The other worldview is held by Jews, Islam, and Christianity. And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe Islam and Christianity. And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body, that the universe just is God, and so that if it did not exist, he would not exist either, and anything you find in the universe is a part of God. The Christian idea is quite different. They think God invented and made the universe, like a man making a picture or composing a tune. A painter is not a picture, and he does not die if the picture is destroyed. You may say he's put a lot of himself into it, but you only mean that its beauty and interest has come out of his head. His skill is not in the picture in the same way that it is in his head, or even in his hands. I expect you see how this difference between pantheists and Christians hangs together with the other one. If you do not take the distinction between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, if you think some things really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like that. You must believe that God is separate from the world and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. The Christian replies, don't talk damn nonsense. For Christianity is a fighting religion. It thinks God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, and all the colors and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of his head as a man makes up a story, but also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists, and insists very loudly, on putting them right again. And of course, that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And of course, that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years, I simply refused to listen to the Christian answer to this question, because I kept on feeling that whatever you say and however clever your arguments are, isn't it much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious? But then, that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water, because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole of the universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. I'm going to go right on. Actually, we'll make a few comments here, and because I think there's a number of important points, and then we'll read the next chapter and probably pause there for this episode. So, what is Lewis doing? Well, first off, he's just drawing distinctions. The first thing he notes, and he notes rightly, is that as a Christian, you don't have to think that all other religions are wrong from start to finish. That's really important. And he contrasts that with atheism in the sense that if you're an atheist, you really do have to think that most humans have made a huge mistake about the one thing that is most important to them. That the vast majority of humans, for the vast majority of history, have just been deeply and utterly confused about what existence is. The atheist is, of course, committed to that. But the Christian is not. The Christian can recognize that in other religions, there are approximations to the truth. And Lewis is firm, saying we're not saying that all religions are true in the fullest sense. He would hold, as I think pretty much all Christians would hold, that there's a perfect vertical. In other religions, there are approximations to the truth. And Lewis is firm, saying we're not saying that all religions are true in the fullest sense. He would hold, as I think pretty much all Christians would hold, that there's a perfect vertical. There's a perfect upright, this is the truth, but that other religious ideas, practices, and traditions can approximate to that or away from that. So you don't have to think as a Christian, and certainly I don't think as a Catholic, that all other religions are wrong in like a full and complete sense. And in fact, that would be foolish, because there's many harmonious cross-sections of the world religions that affirm many similar things: the existence of God, teleology, divine purpose, a moral law, even if they have different articulations, expressions, and specific instances of how these things are instantiated. And rightfully so, Lewis puts it in terms of arithmetic, answers are mutually exclusive. To the extent that somebody holds monotheism, they can't also be an atheist, right? It's like it's either one or the other. It's either God or not God. Well, he's saying the same thing about religion, is that there is only one right answer to a sum, as he puts it. But there's obviously other answers that are more wrong than others. You can get closer to the right answer than others. And that's how he's saying that as Christians, you can see and the other religions, and you can appreciate them, and you can respect them, and I think all of us would say we should be charitable of them. But we should also be willing to have argument and say, well, look, we can't all be right. That's just not possible. So let's try and figure this out. We all believe that there is transcendence. We have good reason for believing this. So let's try and settle our differences, and hopefully we can do it in a way without wanting to choke each other's necks. Excuse me. This in a way without wanting to choke each other's necks. Excuse me. This cough yet lingers. Can you believe it? So the next thing that he goes on to distinguish is the great divide between the monotheistic traditions and a lot of the Eastern religious traditions, which is that between pantheism and, of course, monotheism. And pantheism, which is also sometimes referred to as dualism in some respects, Gnosticism in others, is the idea that the God just is the universe. That whatever the universe is, that there are divine qualities about it, and that if the universe didn't exist, then God would not exist. So it really is equating God with nature or the universe. And this is in pretty stark contrast to the Abrahamic traditions, which say that God is transcendent of nature, that nature is a creation of God, and that it is sustained in being at any, and Lewis doesn't push this point. He says that nature is kind of like a picture, but I would say that's not a perfect analogy. Like, God didn't just paint nature, because once an artist creates a picture, that picture can stand on its own. Right? I paint something, I put it out there, and then it stands on it. It doesn't depend on me anymore. But that is not the nature of the relationship between God and nature. Nature, all of us, everything depends at every single second for its existence on God. that we at every moment that we continue to exist only exists because God continually donates being to us. That is, so I mean, it's radically different. So it's a decent starting analogy that Lewis is using, but it's not like God just flicked the dominoes and that we can just go on existing on our own. It's not like that at all. It's this hierarchy of dependency of being, where if God stopped thinking about us, even for all, is this hierarchy of dependency of being, where if God stopped thinking about us, even for a second, we would just poof out of existence. And that's what a lot of the classic philosophical arguments, like the argument from contingency or motion or change, shows and demonstrates that we have this world of contingent things that exist. They don't have to exist. So there must be some type of basement level of reality, a foundational layer that where the buck stops, so to speak, and explains why any contingent thing exists here and now over nothing at all. And that, of course, we would argue to be God. So I just wanted to make that distinction, and I think Lewis does make that distinction in his book Miracles. I forget if he does it in Mere Christianity. So it's a nice starting analogy, but I would just offer that additional clarity to it. But the point is that God is not nature. He may sustain nature. Nature is dependent radically on God, just as nature. He may sustain nature. Nature is dependent radically on God, just as we are for its existence at any point in time. But what the universe is does not equal God, and that even if the universe wasn't here, if there was no physical reality, God would still exist. So God is transcendent of the universe in the Abrahamic tradition, specifically Christianity, but in many, not all, there are certain Eastern traditions, even Hindu traditions, from my understanding, that do affirm monotheism and a separation between God and the universe, but many are pantheistic. Now, what Lewis does is he kind of backs the moral argument into this. And he says, look, if you agree with pretty much what we've decided in the last couple of chapters, that good and bad are that some things are truly good in this world and other things bad. Like that, if you think that torturing small children or raping small children for fun is truly a wicked thing, and that it's just not a matter of perspective, which I think all of us would do, and I think you would have to be pretty insincere if you're coming from an Eastern pantheistic tradition to say that something like that, like brutally raping and torturing a small child for fun, is just a matter of perspective. Nobody believes that. No, we think that something has seriously gone wrong here. This is objectively bad. And what Lewis is saying is if you hold to that, if you affirm our moral intuitions, and if you followed me on those moral arguments to see that there really is some type of objective, morally perfect standard in reality, then we can't say that the universe is God, because it's incompatible, because then you would have to think that this standard isn't really a standard at all, that the universe is quite obviously a mix of some things that we would consider very good and other things that we consider very bad. And then Lewis kind of goes back to his experience of an atheist and shows that this is not really coherent on any levels. If you affirm that justice, for example, is a real thing that's worth pursuing, you already have it in your mind that there is some standard of what justice must be like. And we can't have drawn that standard from a pantheistic view or an atheistic view, because the atheistic view would just deny that there is some standard of what justice must be like. And we can't have drawn that standard from a pantheistic view or an atheistic view, because the atheistic view would just deny that there's any such thing as that at all, that there is no objective transcendent standard for something like justice. So the complaint itself against God, that the world is unjust, has to implicitly affirm God's existence to even get the argument off the ground, which Lewis is showing, coming from an atheistic point of view. But from a pantheistic point of view, it also doesn't work, because if we want to affirm that some things are really bad and some things are really good, then it's the monotheistic picture that allows us to do that, not the pantheistic one. So his distinction here is, I'll quote from him again, if you do not take the distinction between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. So if you really don't think that anything you find in this world is a part of God. So if you really don't think that objective moral values and duties attain, then sure, it's somewhat easy to affirm pantheism, because it's, you think that It's just really a matter of perspective or a lack of enlightenment or something like that. Lewis continues, but of course, if you think something's really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like that because they're incompatible. So, he continues, you must believe that God is separate from the world and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. And that, of course, is exactly what Christians affirm, that God created the world and that something went wrong with it. Something has gone wrong, and God has gone about trying to set it straight. So the moral argument can actually be backed in as not just to affirm transcendence, but it can also push us out of pantheism and to monotheism. So just through our moral experience and moral theism and to monotheism. So just through our moral experience and moral philosophy, we can argue our way not just to a general religious worldview, but in fact, an even more specific religious worldview, showing that, okay, if this argument is successful, if there's merit to this argument, it really lands us in the monotheistic traditions, with whatever God is, whatever this standard of objective moral values and duties is, this straight line of goodness, as Lewis would put it, from which we make our moral assumptions and assertions, whatever that is, it must be transcendent and radically distinct from physical reality. And that was the kind of thrust, I think, of the argument in this chapter. So let me see if there's anything else that we want to work out here. No, I think that's pretty much it. So he work out here. No, I think that's pretty much it. So he affirms that, hey, as Christians, you don't have to think that all other religions are wrong, but you do have to be willing to have an argument of why the Christian religion is the perfect vertical, if you will, of why it's the one that gets the equation right, even if other ones are closer to right, but maybe not exactly there. So it's both an appreciation for religious distinctions and differences, but at the same time, a willingness to affirm that, hey, there can only be one right answer here, so let's try and figure this out. And I, of course, that's something that resonates deeply with me, and I appreciate it. It's a rejection of sort of a strong form of relativism, which which disgusts me. So, yeah. All right, let's go on to the second chapter then here, which is called The Invasion. And he's going to continue to pull this out a little bit more, and then we'll save the rest for next time. So, continuing on. This is Book 2, Chapter 2, Mere Christianity, The Invasion. Very well, then. Atheism is too simple. And I will tell you another view that is also too simple. It is the view I call Christianity and water, the view which simply says there is a good God in heaven and everything is all right, leaving out all the difficult and terrible doctrines about sin and hell and the devil and the redemption. Both of these are boys' philosophies. It is no good asking for a simple religion. After all, real things are not simple. They look simple, but they are not. The table I am sitting at looks simple, but ask a scientist to tell you what it is really made of, all about the atoms and how the light waves rebound from them and hit my eye and what they do to the optic nerve and what it does to my brain. And of course, you will find that what we call seeing a table lands you in mysteries and complications which you can hardly get to the end of. A child saying a child's prayer looks simple, which you can hardly get to the end of. A child saying a child's prayer looks simple, and if you are content to stop there, well and good. But if you are not, and the modern world usually is not, if you want to go on and ask what is really happening, then you must be prepared for something difficult. If you ask for something more than simplicity, it is silly then to complain that the something more is not simple. Very often, however, the silly procedure is adopted by people who are not silly, but who, consciously or unconsciously, want to destroy Christianity. Such people put up a version of Christianity suitable for a child of 6 and make that the object of their attack. When you try to explain the Christian doctrine as it is really held by an instructed adult, they then complain that you are making their heads turn round and that it is all too complicated, and that if there really were a God, they are sure he would have made religion simple because simplicity is so beautiful, etc. You must be on your guard against made religion simple because simplicity is so beautiful, etc. You must be on your guard against these people, for they will change their ground every minute and only waste your time. Notice, too, their idea of God making religion simple, as if, quote, religion were something God invented, and not his statement to us of certain quite unalterable facts about his own nature. Besides being complicated, reality, in my experience, is usually odd. It is not neat, not obvious, not what you would expect. For instance, when you have grasped that the Earth and all the other planets go around the Sun, you would naturally expect that all the planets were made to match, at all equal distances from each other, say, or distances that regularly increased, or all the same size, or else getting bigger or smaller as you go further from the Sun. In fact, you find no rhyme or reason, that we can see, about either the sizes or the distances, and some of them have one moon, and one has 4, one has 2, some have none, and one has a ring. Reality, and one has 4, one has 2, some have none, and one has a ring. Reality, in fact, is usually something you could not have guessed. That is one of the reasons I believe Christianity. It is a religion you could not have guessed. It has offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected. If it offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But, in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. It is just that queer twist about it that real things have. So let us leave behind all these boys' philosophies, these over-simple answers. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either. What is the problem? A universe that contains much that is obviously bad and apparently meaningless, but containing creatures like ourselves who know that it is bad and meaningless. There are only two views that face all the facts. One is the Christian view that this is a good world that has gone wrong, but still retains the memory of what it ought to have been. The other view is called dualism. Dualism means the belief that there are two equal and independent powers at the back of everything, one of them good and the other bad, and that this universe is the battlefield in which they fight out an endless war. I personally think that next to Christianity, dualism is the manliest and most sensible creed on the market. But it has a catch in it. The two powers, or spirits, or gods, the good one and the bad one, are supposed to be quite independent. They both existed from all eternity. Neither of them made the other. Neither of them has any more right than the other to call itself God. Each presumably thinks it is good and thinks the other bad. One of them likes hatred and cruelty. The other likes love and mercy, and each backs its own view. Now, what do we mean when we call one of them the good power and the other the bad power? Either we are merely saying that what we happen to prefer bad power. Either we are merely saying that what we happen to prefer when we happen to prefer one to the other, like preferring beer to cider, or else we are saying that whatever the two powers think about it, and whichever we humans at the moment happen to like, one of them is actually wrong, actually mistaken, if regarding itself as good. Now, if we mean merely that we happen to prefer the first, then we must give up all talk about good and evil and all that. For good means that you ought to prefer something quite regardless of whether you happen to like it at that given moment. If, quote, being good meant simply enjoying the side you happen to fancy for no real reason, then good would not deserve to be called good. So it must mean that one of the two powers is actually wrong and the other actually right. But the moment you say that, you are putting yourself into the universe a third thing in addition to the two powers, some law or standard or rule of good, which one of the powers conforms to, or rule of good, which one of the powers conforms to, and the other fails to conform to. But since the two powers are judged by this standard, then this standard, or the being who made this standard, is farther back and higher up than either of them, and he will be the real God. In fact, what we meant by calling them good and bad turns out to be that one of them is in a right relation to the real ultimate God, and the other in a wrong relation to him. The same point can be made in a different way. If dualism is true, then the bad power must be a being who likes badness for its own sake. But in reality, we have no experience of anyone liking badness just because it is bad. The nearest we can get to it is in cruelty. But in real life, people are cruel for one of two reasons. Either they are sadists, that is, because they have a sexual perversion which makes cruelty a cause of sensual pleasure to them, or else for the sake of something they are going to get out of it, money or power or safety. But pleasure, money, power, and safety are all, as far as they go, good things. The badness consists in pursuing them by the wrong method, or in the wrong way, or too much. I do not mean, of course, that the people who do this are not desperate in the wrong way or too much. I do not mean, of course, that the people who do this are not desperately wicked. I do mean that wickedness, when you examine it, turns out to be the pursuit of some good in the wrong way. You can be good for the mere sake of goodness. You cannot be bad for the mere sake of badness. You can do a kind action when you are not feeling kind and when it gives you no pleasure, simply because kindness is right. But no one ever did a cruel action simply because cruelty is wrong, only because cruelty was pleasant or useful to him. In other words, badness cannot succeed even in being bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only spoiled goodness. And there must be something good first before it can be spoiled. We call sadism a sexual perversion, but you must first have the idea of a normal sexuality before you can talk of its being perverted. And you can see which is the perversion because you can explain the perverted from the normal and cannot explain the perverted from the normal and cannot explain the normal from the perverted. It follows that this bad power, who is supposed to be on an equal footing with the good power, and to love badness in the same way as a good power loves goodness, is a mere bogey. In order to be bad, he must have good things to want and then to pursue them in the wrong way. He must have impulses which were originally good in order to be able to pervert them. But if he is bad, he cannot supply himself either with good things to desire or with good impulses to pervert. He must be getting both from the good power, and if so, then he is not independent. He is part of the good power's world. He was made either by the good power or by some power above them both. Put it more simply still, to be bad, he must exist and have intelligence and will. But existence, intelligence, and will are in themselves good. Therefore, he must be getting them from the good power. Even to be bad, he must borrow or steal from his opponent. Or even to be bad, he must borrow or steal from his opponent. And do you now begin to see why Christianity has always said that the devil is a fallen angel? That it is not a mere story for children. It is a real recognition of the fact that evil is a parasite, not an original thing. The powers which enable evil to carry on are powers given it by goodness. All the things which enable a bad man to be effectively bad are in themselves good things. Resolution, cleverness, good looks, existence itself. That is why dualism, in a strict sense, will not work. But I freely admit that real Christianity, as distinct from Christianity in water, goes much nearer to dualism than people think. One of the things that surprised me when I first read the New Testament seriously was that it talks so much about a dark power in the universe, a mighty evil spirit who was held to be the power behind death and disease and sin. The difference is that Christianity thinks this dark power was created by God, and was good when he was created and went wrong. Christianity agrees with dualism that the universe is at war. Does not think this is a war between independent powers. It thinks it is a civil war, a rebellion, and that we are living in a part of the universe occupied by the rebel. Enemy-occupied territory. That is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. When you go to church, you are really listening in to the secret wireless from our friends. That is why the enemy is so anxious to prevent us from going. He does it by playing on our conceit and laziness and intellectual snobbery. I know someone will ask me, do you really mean, at this time of day, to reintroduce our old friend the devil? Hoofs and horns and all? Well, what the time of the day, friend the devil? Hoofs and horns and all? Well, what the time of the day has to do with it, I do not know. And I am not particular about the hoofs and horns. But in other respects, my answer is yes, I do. I do not claim to know anything about his personal appearance. If anybody really wants to know him better, I would say to that person, don't worry, if you really want to, you will. Whether you'll like it when you do is another question. Oh man, C.S. Lewis he's just so good. His ending paragraphs for these chapters are just so memorable and so good. But even beyond that is his ability to communicate deep philosophical and theological truths and arguments in such a simple way. This simple 1, 2, 3, 4.5 page chapter has so much philosophical foundations and theological foundations, it's almost hard to understand where to unpack it. I mean, he's talking about the privation theories of evil here. He's again using a moral argument to show why dualism doesn't quite work. So let's just take it bit by bit, and I'll offer a bit of commentary, then let you have your day. So we'll start with so first off, he calls this idea of Christianity and water a boy's philosophy. So he says atheism is too simple, that isn't going to work. But we have this other problem, which is Christianity and water. That, to quote him, that there is a good God in heaven and everything is all right, and that we just leave out all those difficult and terrible doctrines about sin and hell and the devil and all that stuff. Now, boy, is that not relevant today. There's been kind of like surveys done, especially among younger people, of what they actually believe. And it turns out that most of them are not as agnostic as they like to say. They actually, most younger people who are not religiously devout believe in something that's called a moralistic therapeutic deism. Moralistic therapeutic deism. And what that is essentially what Lewis just described, this idea of Christianity and water. They believe that God is out there, but he's not entirely interested in what's going on. But if you need, to shoot up a quick prayer, or if you need to feel like things are all right, then well, at least you've got God. At least you've got good old God. But any of that other stuff or tough religious teaching, they just don't pay any attention to that. So it's moralistic. It's therapeutic to them, and it's deistic in a sense that God isn't really actively involved in our affairs or anything. He's kind of standoffish. If he'll be there if you really, really need him, but that's all he's really there for. And Lewis is just saying this is a child's philosophy. Look, if we're going to explore Christianity and we want to know it, we have to move beyond the kindergarten stuff. And I'm with him there 100%. I accept supernaturalism in its full rigor, if you will, because we want to be consistent. So he goes on and just makes some interesting observations that, if it's no good asking for a simple religion, because, most things in reality aren't all that simple. Things in reality not only turn out to be a bit unexpected, but also a bit odd. And he says this is the one thing that struck him about Christianity. It's not really a religion we could have guessed at. Once we see it and understand it, it makes sense, but it's not something we would have guessed. It's not something we could have made up, if you will. He says if it was simple, if it was a religion we could have guessed at, then he would have been skeptical of it, and I think we all should have been skeptical of it. But he says, and I'm quoting here, in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone could have made up. It has just that sort of queer twist about it that real things have. And certainly anybody, as we go through this book, you'll see many of those twists. But that's an interesting point. It's worth considering. He also just brings up the irony of people that constantly attack a straw man version of Christianity, really like the 6-year-old's version of Christianity. But then when you try to go a little bit deeper and say, hey, no, this actually has deep intellectual roots, we can make some powerful arguments here, then the retreat is, oh, you're making things too complicated. God would have made religions. So it's like a damned if you do, damned if you won't with a lot of people. And Lewis is saying, look, you just got to ignore these people. They're not being sincere. They're just trying to waste your time. And certainly I've been in that conversation probably. So it's like a damned if you do, damned if you won't with a lot of people. And Lewis is saying, look, you just got to ignore these people. They're not being sincere. They're just trying to waste your time. And certainly I've been in that conversation probably a million times. I used to be that person who used to make that argument. I used to be, because I wasn't being sincere. I really wasn't interested. Eventually, through the grace of God, I became interested. But yeah, I can certainly relate to that. Now, let's move on here to his critique of dualism. And what he's getting at is a very deep and important Christian doctrine, which is the privation account of evil. And I talked about this on an episode briefly on Sunday School of what God expects of us. And this is a very, very important thing to understand, both philosophically and theologically, that evil is not something that has positive ontological status. What does that mean? Evil is not something that exists in and of itself. It's not like there's good and then there's evil, something that exists in and of itself. It's not like there's good and then there's evil. There's like this thing over here and this other thing over there. No, rather what Christianity gets us to realize, and what we can realize through philosophy alone, and Lewis makes some of the arguments here, is that badness and evil, when we really examine it, is a lack. It's a hole where goodness should be. And Lewis does a very nice job of explaining this and saying this is why dualism won't work for a couple of reasons. One is that if we're committed to saying that one power is bad and another power is good, well, how are we differentiating between these two? They can't be the only independent things in our experience, because it seems like we're judging these things off of a standard that would have to be higher up and further out than both of those. And then whatever that is would be the ultimate good. That thing would be God. So even if there were warring powers or spirits or whatever, in order to even make moral judgments about them like we do, we're implicitly committed to there being an even more fundamental layer of reality. But if we try to work that through, we're still going to trace ourselves back to a God that is more foundational than both of them, that is the highest conceivable being. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the highest conceivable being. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that if dualism is true, I'm quoting here, the bad power must be a being who likes badness for his own sake. But this is where he gets into the privation account of evil. But in reality, we have no experience of anyone liking badness just because it's bad. Like badness is a thing you can get your hands on. Rather, people who do cruel or wicked or evil things are really just pursuing things that in and of themselves are perfectly good, but pursuing them in the wrong way, in a perverted way. So pleasure, money, power, safety, Lewis says, are, as far as they go, they're all good things. But when people pursue them at the expense of others, say when they have a lack of love, that's when they do wicked or evil things. So we can actually think of evil in a simple, and we can expand this in future episodes, as a human evil, as an undermining or ignoring of our human capacity for love. That when we're willing to pursue money or power by love, that when we're willing to pursue money or power by hurting other people, we're pursuing things that we think are good, that will make us happy, and happiness is a good thing. But because we have a lack of love, because love is missing for our neighbor, for other people, for God, that is where evil comes from. So evil is not some positive thing within us. It might have like positive effects on the world in the sense that, like, yeah, if you hit somebody, like they get a black eye, that's a real thing. But when you really examine it, realize, no, why evil happens is because something is missing that should have been there that isn't there. Either a certain capacity for love, a certain understanding of moral facts, knowledge. It always comes back to a lack or a privation. So yeah, nobody denies that like hitting somebody in the face is a real physical act. But when you examine it, when you look at like what is really happening here, you realize that what is the root of that act is something that just isn't there. It's a lack, it's a privation. That just isn't there. It's a lack, it's a privation. That is a very deep and important philosophical and theological.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.